Halloween night had always been a favorite for Tommy Cooper. The autumn air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of burning leaves and pumpkins left out to rot. The streets of Eldridge were alive with children in costumes, their laughter echoing through the small, sleepy town. But inside the Cooper house, all was quiet. Tommy, barely 10, sat at the window, watching the costumed figures drift by like ghosts in the twilight. His hands fiddled nervously with the edge of his shirt, though he wasn't sure why. He'd been excited earlier, counting down the minutes until his parents left for the neighborhood Halloween party. It meant freedom, staying up late, and eating candy with his older sister Molly. But now, with the sun sinking behind the trees and shadows creeping across the floor, that excitement had drained away, replaced by an uneasy feeling he couldn't quite place. It had started with a sound, a soft, deliberate creak that came from above. He turned his head toward the ceiling, staring hard at the old plaster, waiting to hear it again. It was probably nothing, he thought. The house was old, the kind where every step on the floorboards made the walls groan. But then the creak came again, this time louder. "Molly," Tommy called, glancing toward the hallway where his sister was getting ready upstairs. "Yeah?" she answered, her voice muffled behind the bathroom door. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Tommy paused, listening. The silence stretched out uncomfortably, like the house itself was holding its breath. But now there was only the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. "Never mind," he muttered, feeling foolish. Still, his eyes drifted to the ceiling again. There was something about the attic that always made him uneasy. He didn't like going up there, not since they'd moved in. It was cold and cramped, full of old furniture covered in white sheets, like forgotten ghosts from another time. And lately, he'd been getting the feeling that something was up there, something that didn't belong. "Tommy, stop creeping yourself out," he whispered to himself, shaking his head. But as the minutes dragged on, he couldn't help but feel the prickle of unease return. It wasn't just the sound. The air in the house felt different tonight, heavier. The shadows seemed to stretch further than they should, pooling in the corners of the room like dark puddles. Every flicker of the lantern lights made him jump, his imagination spinning wild tales of monsters lurking just out of sight. He turned back to the window, hoping the sight of trick-or-treaters might calm his nerves. Instead, he saw something strange in the reflection. A movement, quick and subtle, behind him. A shadow, long and slender, flickering in the doorway to the hall. He spun around, but the doorway was empty. The air felt colder now, as if a breeze had blown through, though none of the windows were open. His eyes darted toward the stairs leading up to the second floor, and the attic. The creak came again, loud and clear this time, followed by the faintest rustle, like something shifting its weight. "Tommy!" Molly's voice snapped him out of his trance. She appeared at the top of the stairs, dressed in her witch costume, black hat askew. "You ready or what?" Tommy blinked, still staring at the ceiling. "Didn't you hear that?" "Hear what?" "That noise. It's coming from the attic." Molly rolled her eyes. "It's an old house. You get used to it." "But..." He hesitated, unsure of how to explain the feeling. It wasn't just the creaks and groans. It was the way the air felt thick with something. Something watching. Waiting. Molly, seeing the look on his face, softened. "Look, it's Halloween. If there was something up there, wouldn't it have come down by now?" She gave him a playful nudge. "Come on, don't be a baby." But as Molly turned to grab her bag, Tommy's gaze drifted back to the ceiling, where another creak echoed through the house. He swallowed hard, his heart thudding in his chest. Deep down, he knew something was up there, and it wasn't going to stay hidden for long. Later that night, after his parents had left and the house had settled into an eerie quiet, Tommy couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He and Molly had watched a couple of old horror movies on their black and white TV, but his mind kept wandering back to the attic. Every time the screen flickered in the dim room, Tommy felt like the shadows behind him were shifting. Molly, oblivious to his anxiety, had already fallen asleep on the couch, her witch hat tipped over her face. Tommy glanced at her, envying how calm she seemed, and then back at the staircase leading up to the second floor, and the attic. His chest tightened. He wanted to ignore it, to pretend the sound earlier had just been the wind or the house settling like Molly said. But a nagging voice in the back of his head wouldn't let it go. The attic had always unnerved him, ever since they moved in. His parents had brushed it off, but he remembered how cold it had felt when they first explored the house, how the air in the attic seemed heavier, like it was hiding something. Tommy stood, tiptoeing past the couch so he wouldn't wake Molly. His eyes followed the line of shadows on the wall as he climbed the stairs, the old wooden steps creaking beneath his feet. At the top, he paused outside the attic door, his hand hovering over the cold metal knob. He hesitated. The air here felt different, thicker, almost damp, like the air before a storm. The silence was so deep it rang in his ears. What if something really was up there? But before he could talk himself out of it, he turned the knob, the door groaning open on its rusty hinges. The air inside was cold, colder than the rest of the house, like the attic had been forgotten by time. Tommy's flashlight beam swept across the room, cutting through the dust and shadows. The attic looked just as it always had, cluttered with old trunks, broken furniture, and sheets draped over forgotten belongings. But the light wavered as his hand trembled. He stepped inside, feeling the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath him. The beam of his flashlight moved slowly over the room, but no matter how hard he looked, he couldn't find what he was searching for, or what he feared. The shadows seemed still, and yet his skin prickled with the unmistakable sense of being watched. And then, there it was. Near the far corner, tucked behind a stack of old boxes, the light flickered across something dark, darker than the rest of the room. It wasn't just a shadow cast by the clutter or the dim light. It was something else. Tommy froze, his breath catching in his throat. The shape in the corner shifted, as if sensing it had been seen. For a moment, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. But then it moved again, slowly, deliberately, seeming to crawl along the floor, sticking close to the walls as if trying to remain hidden. The flashlight beam flickered as he tried to hold it steady, his heart pounding in his chest. The shadow wasn't just a trick of the light. It had mass, depth, and the way it moved. It was deliberate, almost predatory. Tommy's instincts screamed at him to run, to shut the door and never look back. But he couldn't tear his eyes away. The shadow paused, hovering near an old mirror propped against the wall. For a moment he thought it might retreat back into the darkness, but then, slowly, it began to rise. The shape stretched upward, its edges blurring and shifting like smoke. Tommy's breath hitched as it took on a vague, humanoid form, its head too large, its limbs too long, as if it had been stretched beyond the limits of human shape. And though it had no eyes, Tommy could feel its gaze locked on him. The cold in the room deepened, and the shadows around the creature seemed to ripple as it drew closer. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered out. Tommy gasped, stumbling backward, nearly tripping over a broken chair. His hand scrambled to switch the light back on, but before he could, the room was plunged into complete darkness. A whisper of movement stirred the air, the sound of something brushing against the floor. Too close. Panicked, Tommy slammed the door shut and bolted down the stairs, heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He didn't stop until he was back in the living room, his chest heaving, sweat chilling his skin. Behind him, the house was still and quiet, but Tommy knew the truth now. There was something in the attic, and it was awake. Tommy sat on the edge of the couch, his legs pulled up to his chest, staring wide-eyed at the dark staircase. Molly was still asleep, oblivious to what had just happened upstairs. The house was quiet, but it felt wrong. Too quiet, like the air had been sucked out of the room. The shadows in the corner seemed to shift on their own, crawling ever so slightly as if something was hiding inside them, waiting. He considered waking Molly, but he wasn't sure she'd believe him. She had dismissed his worries earlier, and now, telling her about the shadow might make him sound crazy. But deep down, Tommy knew something had changed. The attic wasn't just a creepy, forgotten part of the house anymore. Something had come alive up there, and it wasn't going away. The clock on the mantel ticked slowly toward midnight, and with each passing minute, the air in the room seemed to grow colder. Tommy shivered, pulling the blanket around him. The silence pressed in on him from all sides, thick and suffocating. Then it came again, a soft creak, barely audible but unmistakable. The sound drifted from the top of the stairs like someone, or something, was shifting its weight above. Tommy's breath caught in his throat. The shadows in the living room seemed to grow deeper, their edges darker, more defined. They twisted unnaturally, pooling in the corners and along the floor, like ink spreading across paper. Tommy's heart pounded as he stood up, moving cautiously toward the staircase. He didn't want to go back up there, but something deep inside him told him he needed to keep an eye on the attic. If that thing got out, if it came downstairs, he didn't know what it would do. He wasn't sure he wanted to find out. His flashlight flickered in his hand, casting weak beams of light into the dark hallway as he crept closer to the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself was thickening, pushing against him. At the foot of the stairs, he stopped and listened. Nothing. The house was dead still again, but the chill remained. Suddenly, there was a thud, a heavy, unmistakable sound from the attic above, followed by the creak of something moving across the floor. Tommy's grip on the flashlight tightened as he took a step back. That's when the lights in the house flickered. First, it was just a dim pulse, like a heartbeat. But then the entire room plunged into darkness. The flashlight sputtered and went out in his hands. "Molly!" Tommy gasped, stumbling backward into the living room. "Molly, wake up!" Molly groaned, rubbing her eyes as she sat up, annoyed. "What is it now?" "The lights. They went out." Tommy's voice shook. "It's coming downstairs. The shadow from the attic. It's coming." Molly squinted at him, still groggy. "What are you talking about? You're just freaked out from the movie." But before she could finish, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Molly's words died on her lips as she suddenly noticed the shift. Her eyes darted to the darkened hallway, her expression turning from irritation to concern. What happened to the lights?" "I told you," Tommy whispered. "It's coming." The room seemed to darken even more, as if the shadows were growing thicker, filling the space with something more than just darkness. It was suffocating, pressing in on them from all sides. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Tommy saw it, an unnatural ripple in the blackness near the base of the stairs. A shape began to form, its edges blurring as it slithered forward, stretching along the walls and floor like a living, breathing thing. Molly's face went pale as she finally saw it too. "What the?" The shadow seemed to pulse, its form shifting in a sickening, fluid motion. It was bigger now, much bigger than when Tommy had first seen it in the attic. It spread along the floor like liquid darkness, slinking toward them inch by inch. The cold deepened, the room growing almost unbearably frigid. "It's getting stronger," Tommy whispered, backing toward the couch, dragging Molly with him. "It's feeding on us, on our fear." Molly's eyes were wide with terror now. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How do we stop it?" Tommy's mind raced. The thing had been growing ever since he first saw it. It wasn't just hiding anymore. It was alive now, and somehow, it was getting stronger the more they feared it. His thoughts spun back to something his father had once said, half joking. "Monsters thrive in the dark, but they're powerless in the light." "Molly," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have to find a way to stop it before it gets too strong. It's not going to stay in the attic anymore." Molly nodded, her face pale. "But how?" Tommy swallowed hard, glancing toward the staircase. We need to go back up to the attic. There's something up there. Something that made this thing. We need to find out what it is before the shadows take over the whole house. With a reluctant glance toward the looming darkness creeping across the floor, Molly nodded. Let's go. They turned toward the stairs, their only hope lying in the attic's terrible secret. Tommy and Molly crept up the staircase together, each step punctuated by the soft groan of old wood and the growing weight of dread in the air. The shadows seemed to cling to them, dragging behind as if they had their own intentions. The attic door loomed ahead, barely visible in the darkness, but they could feel it. Whatever was up there, waiting in the attic, had changed the very atmosphere of the house. Tommy's hand shook as he gripped the cold doorknob, the chill of it biting into his palm. He hesitated, glancing at Molly, whose face was tight with fear but determined. We need to know, he whispered. We need to understand what it is. She nodded, swallowing hard. Let's get this over with. Tommy turned the knob and slowly pushed the door open. The air that greeted them was colder than before, as if the attic had become a vault for something far worse than just shadows. Their flashlights flickered in unison, casting shaky beams across the dusty floor. The room was the same as before, old trunks and broken furniture crowded together, their ghostly forms draped in sheets. But now the shadows felt alive, writhing just out of reach of the light. We have to find something that explains this, Tommy said, trying to steady his voice. There has to be a reason this thing is here. Molly pointed toward a corner where an old, half-rotted chest sat, the leather straps crumbling. Over there, she said, her voice hushed. That chest. It looks different. Tommy didn't question her instinct. Together they crossed the room, their flashlights illuminating the way. As they approached the chest, Tommy noticed something strange. Beneath the thick layers of dust, faint etchings covered the wood, symbols that looked ancient and sinister, as if carved by someone long ago. The closer they got, the more the air seemed to hum, vibrating with an unseen energy. He knelt down, wiping the dust away with his sleeve. Molly leaned in, her brow furrowing as she traced the symbols with her fingers. What is this? She asked, glancing at Tommy. It doesn't look like anything I've ever seen. Tommy's heart raced as he flipped the rusted latch open. The lid creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the attic as it slowly lifted. Inside the chest was an old leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Beneath the journal lay several worn items, a tarnished silver locket, a faded photograph of a man and woman standing in front of the house, and something far darker, a small, carved figurine, barely larger than Tommy's hand, twisted and deformed, made of something that looked almost like bone. Tommy picked up the journal, opening it carefully. The handwriting inside was cramped and hurried, but still legible. He skimmed the pages, his heart sinking as the words began to paint a picture far worse than he had imagined. This house, it's cursed, he whispered, flipping through the entries. The man who built it, he wasn't just a normal guy. He was into something dark, something evil. Molly leaned closer, reading over his shoulder. He was trying to summon something, wasn't he? Tommy nodded, his voice tight with fear. Yeah. It says here that he performed rituals, some kind of dark magic. He was obsessed with it. He believed there was something beyond this world in the shadows, something that could be controlled. But he lost control. The shadow he summoned, it killed him. Molly's face paled. And now it's feeding on us. Tommy's hands trembled as he flipped to the final entry, scrawled hastily in the journal. The words were almost unreadable, as if written in a frenzy. The creature grows with fear. It is bound to the shadows but cannot leave the house. I can no longer control it. Only at dawn can the light banish it. I've hidden the key to its banishment, but it may be too late. Tommy's heart raced. There's a way to stop it. Molly's eyes were wide, desperate. How? Tommy scanned the page again, his mind racing. He says there's a key, a way to banish it at dawn. But he doesn't say what it is. We need to find it. A loud thud echoed from behind them, making both of them jump. The shadow had followed them into the attic. It was bigger now, filling the room with its presence, growing bolder as the night wore on. It rippled along the walls, crawling across the floor toward them. "We have to hurry!" Molly shouted, grabbing the locket and the carved figurine. "Maybe these things are part of it." Tommy stuffed the journal under his arm, his eyes darting toward the window. The night outside was deep and unforgiving, but he could see the faintest hint of pale light in the distance. Dawn was coming. But would it come soon enough? As the shadow closed in, its long, distorted form stretching toward them like claws, Tommy felt the cold grip of fear tightening around his heart. Whatever they had to do to banish it, they had little time left. "Come on!" Tommy shouted, bolting for the stairs. Molly followed close behind, the shadow swirling at their heels as they fled from the attic, their only hope now lying in the cryptic final words of the journal. The creature was growing, and soon there would be nowhere left to run. The door slammed behind them, cutting off the creeping shadow, but Tommy and Molly knew it wouldn't hold for long. They could hear the unsettling rustle of movement from the attic above. The creature was stirring, more alive than ever. The air in the house had grown so cold, it felt like they were standing outside in a winter storm, their breath visible in the dark. Molly clutched the silver locket and carved figurine tightly in her hands as they stumbled into the living room, hearts pounding in their chests. "What now?" she gasped, her eyes wide with fear. "We've got the journal and these weird things, but I still don't know what to do." Tommy set the journal down on the coffee table, flipping back through the pages in a frenzy. "The journal says the creature can only be banished at dawn," he muttered, scanning the pages. "But there's a key. Something that will help us hold it off until then. It has to be here." Another creak echoed from above, followed by the unmistakable sound of the shadow slithering down the stairs, drawing closer to them. It wasn't just hiding anymore. It was hunting. "Molly, look through the stuff from the chest," Tommy urged, his voice trembling. "There has to be something that will help us." Molly nodded, quickly dumping the contents of the locket and figurine onto the floor. She turned the tarnished locket over in her hand, prying it open with her fingernails. Inside was a small, faded portrait of the same man from the photograph, a face twisted with fear. Beneath the portrait, scratched into the metal, were words in a language neither of them could read. "Some kind of charm," Molly whispered, running her fingers over the symbols. "Maybe it's part of the ritual to keep the shadow away." Tommy glanced at the carving of the grotesque figure, a twisted, skeletal thing with limbs too long and too thin, its face a hollow void. "This thing," he said, his voice shaky. "I think it's what the shadow used to be before it became whatever it is now." He was about to say more when the lights flickered again. The entire house seemed to groan as though it were being stretched, pulled into something darker. The air thickened, and a cold, unnatural wind began to stir in the room, even though all the windows were closed. Suddenly, the shadow spilled into the hallway, moving faster now, larger and more defined. Its body twisted unnaturally as it slithered along the walls, crawling toward them. Its shape had changed, taller, more menacing, with jagged edges that reached out like claws. It seemed to drag the darkness with it, consuming the light from the flashlights and lanterns in the room. "It's coming!" Molly screamed, backing up against the couch. Tommy frantically flipped through the journal, his fingers shaking. There has to be something. Anything. Then he found it. A passage describing the creature's weakness to light, but not just any light. It spoke of a charm, an object that could trap the darkness long enough to stop its advance. His eyes widened as he scanned the rest of the page. "The locket!" Tommy shouted. "It says here the locket is enchanted. It's meant to reflect the shadow's own darkness back at it. It can trap it, but only for a short time." Molly didn't hesitate. She lifted the locket high as the shadow lunged toward them. Its form rippled unnaturally, its darkness spreading across the room like a wave. The air thickened, and Tommy could feel his skin prickling with the cold fear the creature brought with it. But as the shadow neared, Molly thrust the locket forward, the strange symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. The creature recoiled, hissing as though it had been burned. Its shadowy form wavered, retreating slightly. "It's working," Molly gasped, her hand shaking as she held the locket toward the shadow. But even as the creature shrank back, it pressed forward again, its shape twisting and expanding as if testing the limits of the charm's power. "We can't hold it off for long," Tommy said, his voice trembling. "We have to trap it until dawn. The journal said it's the only way." The shadow hissed again, its long, jagged limbs reaching toward them. The light from the locket dimmed, and the cold in the room grew sharper, biting at their skin. The creature was relentless, pushing against the magic as if determined to break through. Tommy grabbed the carved figurine from the floor, holding it up alongside the locket. "It says here this figurine is part of the spell," he shouted over the roar of the wind. "It's what the shadow used to be, before it was bound to this house. Maybe it can be bound again." The shadow's form faltered as the light from the locket and the presence of the figurine worked together. It rippled, retreating slightly, its jagged form wavering as if caught between two worlds. But then, a sudden burst of cold air blasted through the room, and the lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Tommy's heart pounded in his chest as he heard the shadow slither closer. "Molly, hold on!" he shouted, gripping the figurine tightly in his hands. Outside, the first faint glimmer of dawn began to break through the horizon, casting a pale light into the room. "We just have to hold it off until sunrise," Tommy whispered, praying it would be enough. As the shadow surged forward, a final, desperate struggle began. The shadow lunged, its massive, twisting form filling the room, blotting out every trace of light. Its long, jagged limbs stretched toward Tommy and Molly, its presence sucking the warmth from the air, turning the space into a frozen, suffocating void. Tommy's grip on the figurine tightened as he felt the chill seep into his bones. Molly held the glowing locket, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. The light from the locket flickered, dimming under the relentless pressure of the shadow, but it still held, a fragile shield between them and the creature. "It's too strong," Molly gasped, her voice shaking. "The locket isn't enough." Tommy knew she was right. The journal had warned that the charm could only hold the shadow for so long. As dawn inched closer, the creature grew more desperate, more violent. The darkness swirled around them, pressing in from all sides. He could feel it, its hunger, its desire to consume them completely before the light of day could banish it. "There's something else we're missing," Tommy muttered under his breath, his eyes darting to the journal lying open on the floor. He knelt quickly, scanning the final entry once more. The cryptic words seemed to leap off the page. "The shadow feeds on fear. Only in its true form can it be banished." "True form," Tommy whispered, his mind racing. He looked down at the grotesque carved figurine in his hand, the twisted skeletal creature that had once been the shadow before it became something far worse. The answer was right in front of him. The shadow wasn't just feeding on their fear. It was growing stronger by staying hidden in the dark, in its distorted, formless shape. "We have to force it into its real form," Tommy shouted, holding up the figurine for Molly to see. "The journal says we need to reveal it. It's the only way to stop it before dawn." Molly's eyes widened. But how? Tommy glanced toward the window, where the faintest streaks of pale light were just beginning to break through the horizon. The first hint of dawn. The house remained dark, the shadow choking the light out of every corner, but the dawn's arrival was undeniable. He knew what they had to do. "We need light. Real light," Tommy said, his voice steady with newfound determination. "The locket isn't enough. We need to expose it to the sunlight." Molly's eyes darted to the boarded-up window. "But we've got no time. It's almost on top of us." The creature surged forward again, its jagged limbs sweeping through the air, clawing toward them. The locket's light sputtered, flickering out for just a second before flaring back to life. The creature let out a low, guttural hiss that sent shivers down Tommy's spine. "There's no choice," Tommy said, his voice firm. "I'm going to rip the boards off the window. You need to keep it back as long as you can." "Tommy, no!" Molly started to protest, but there was no time. Tommy ran toward the window, grabbing a nearby chair and slamming it against the wooden boards covering the glass. The wood cracked but didn't break. He swung again, harder this time, splintering the boards. Pale light spilled in through the cracks, flooding the room with the faint glow of dawn. The shadow recoiled, shrieking as the light touched it, its form shuddering. Molly held the locket high, forcing the creature back, but the strain was showing on her face. Sweat dripped from her forehead, and the cold was biting into her skin. "Hurry!" Molly screamed, her voice tight with fear and pain. Tommy smashed the chair into the boards again, finally breaking through. The last board cracked in half, and sunlight poured into the room, bright and pure. The shadow let out a terrible, inhuman scream, its dark form twisting violently as the light struck it full force. Tommy turned, holding the figurine in front of him like a talisman. "Now!" he shouted to Molly. "It's in its true form. This is our chance." Molly threw the locket at the shadow, the light from it flaring one last time. The shadow convulsed, its body no longer formless. It had become something solid, something real. The twisted, skeletal shape from the carving in Tommy's hand was now reflected in the creature before them. Its jagged limbs flailed wildly, its hollow face gaping in silent terror. The sunlight burned through the shadow's form, unraveling it piece by piece, the darkness disintegrating as the first rays of dawn filled the room. Tommy and Molly stood frozen, watching as the creature's form dissolved into the air, its horrible shriek fading into nothingness. For a moment, the house was silent, the oppressive weight of fear and darkness lifting. The cold in the air disappeared, replaced by the soft warmth of the morning light filtering through the shattered window. It's gone," Molly whispered, sinking to her knees. "We did it." Tommy stood still, panting, staring at the spot where the shadow had been moments before. The carved figurine in his hand had cracked in half, its power drained. He dropped it to the floor, his legs shaking from the adrenaline. "We made it," he said, almost in disbelief. Outside, the sun had fully risen, casting golden light across the landscape. The nightmare was over, but Tommy knew they had come dangerously close to being consumed by the darkness forever. As the morning sun bathed the room in warmth, Tommy and Molly sat together on the floor, exhausted but safe, the shadow's terror finally vanquished. For now.